I was sitting with my mother towards the end of her life, and I said to her, "Mum, what did you do when Dad came back from the war so traumatised?" And she looked at me and she said, "Bonita, I didn't know what to do." And that's all she said. So my mother was incredibly resourceful. During the war, she set up a little business where she did sewing for people, and pretty much paid off the house while Dad was away in the war. And the sewing machine was a very central object in our household. She made all of our clothes. I distinctly remember the first time I got a dress bought from a shop, and that was when I was 9, and I was very happy about getting a dress from a shop. So for some reason, I was drawn to collapsing together the machine gun and the sewing machine. It's a very complex piece, I think. My first reading of it for myself was that I was kind of ameliorating the weapon of war by making it out of the female or the feminine machine, the Singer treadle sewing machine. But other people saw it and had different interpretations. Another interpretation is that perhaps the sound of the sewing machine would trigger traumatic episodes. Another interpretation has been that the sewing machine and as a machine gun kind of represents the tensions in the relationship between my mother and father, and so on and so on. It's made out of Mum's treadle sewing machine and bobby pins. I'll just show you some detail of how that came together. So I used all the bits and pieces, all the lovely little mechanisms from the sewing machine to represent the gun. And I guess one of the ironies is that the word singer appears on the treadle sewing machine. So I decided that I should go to Egypt and Palestine, or Israel now, and retrace my father's tour of duty and just see what I would find there. And passing through the desert, the Sinai desert, at every step along the way there were watchtowers, really ancient ones like this, and more current ones like this, with these massive walls that went for kilometre after kilometre after a kilometre, with the watchtowers periodically within sight of each other. Bam, bam, bam. And I started taking photographs of these watchtowers. It's still very much work in progress. I've got some ideas for these watchtower photographs, but in the meantime I made a watchtower out of a double bed from the period of my mother and father's early marriage.
And the first slide is by artist Sean Gladwell. And Joan is correct that Sean went to Afghanistan in 2009, and the work before you was actually produced in Australia. Sean wanted to make the work overseas in Afghanistan, but it just didn't quite come off. But he was very dedicated to this work. And what it is, you're seeing a still from a video work, a 2-channel video work. And it runs for approximately 8 minutes, and what happens is each of these soldiers come on, they strip down the weapon and build it back again and walk off. A field strip is a process where you pull the gun apart and put it back together to clean the gun so it can still can continue to work. Sean is interested in the way that soldiers' bodies are developed, how they are constructed and developed as a soldier, how they become aware of space, how they exist in space. That was quite central to the work that he was making, because he investigated the soldiers that he witnessed as he was in Afghanistan, the Australian Defence Force. He saw them as a type of subculture that brought to Afghanistan various rituals, various belief systems that were imposed upon the landscape and competed with other cultures that were there, other armed forces, as well as the traditional cultures that lived in Afghanistan. He's quite sensitive to the young soldiers, and he wanted to portray a sense of the soldiers themselves being somewhat, stranded to some degree, going overseas and trying to make sense of the world in which they are now involved in. And in these works, he quotes from Caspar David Friedrich's work, which often has a figure looking into a sublime landscape, and you see the figure from behind. So he adopts this colonial sense of the sublime, and he looks at it in a modern contemporary sense. The sublime is not only a vast landscape, but it's a complicated political space as well. And the Australian individual, the soldier, is in this sublime landscape. So he's investigating these types of ideas relating to soldiering. This work is also by Sean Glebel, and it was completed in 2009 as well, and it was first shown at an exhibition in Casula as well, in an exhibition related to Vietnam, the Vietnam War. And they are pictures, scans of Sean's father, who was a Vietnam veteran. And the tattoos relate to his father's service. And Sean saw this work as focused on the tattoos, and saw the tattoos as kind of a memory, a trace of the conflict, the experiences of war and the experiences of being in the military, as still being present within the skin, being part of the body itself. So Sean brings this entire heritage to his work, and he's quite interested in the experience of being in the military and being in war. And for Sean, it's both obviously a positive and negative. He saw his father's experiences. He saw the trauma related to that, but he also saw the positives in the military life aspects that his father enjoyed, which was the physical culture. That also Sean's father continued, it was a strong part of his life, and even Sean's as well. I'll move on now to Charles Green and Lyndall Brown's work, who I said worked together as one artist. Charles Green and Lyndall Brown travelled to Afghanistan and Iraq in 2007, and they were very fascinated with the way that, with the machines and the process of bringing in an entire military force into a landscape. And with Afghanistan, it's a landlocked country, you have to do this by air. So they focused on the technology, the helicopters or the aircraft that was able to fly thousands of kilometres and plonk this new militarised space onto the landscape. And they were fascinated by the landscapes, these alien, murky landscapes that evolved out of the military processes. They involve vast infrastructure, but they're not infrastructure airports that we have in Australia, or shipping ports which are meant to last for 50 or 100 years. They are vast infrastructure that allow this kind of developmental spaces and communication, but they dissolve and dissipate in years. These works actually incorporate the ziggurat of Ur within them. You can't make them out, but the ziggurat of Ur is a 3,000-year-old man-made building, and they're kind of showing the way that cultures are completely absorbed within these new militarised spaces. So the last artist I want to look at is Ex de Medici, who went to the Solomon Islands in 2009. And she looks at she looks at the experience of the Australian soldiers and the Australian Defence Force and their role in the Solomon Islands, and sees them as one of many forces, cultural forces that have washed up onto the island and have become part of the island. During the Second World War, the Japanese invaded the island, and then pretty much 6 months later the Americans took hold of the island as well. And at the end of the war, the Americans left all their equipment, all their aircraft, their ordnance. A lot of it, their ordnance wasn't exploded, they just left it as a big dump. But these again, she represents a similar sort of alien space, which is being taken over and it's, completely changed through the process of military forces coming to an island. This work here shows a Chinese and Japanese flag in the background of the palm oil plants, and she's trying to suggest again this contemporary realm of new forces, new international interests coming ashore and taking control of the island. And this was part of the political realm in which the Australians were involved in. But she certainly sees the Australians as part of this taking over, or part of the process of coming ashore as well. Throughout her career, for over the last 10 years, in fact, she's looked at weapons, machine guns, and she's linked them to various insects as well, and done this through an 18th century colonial kind of style. And what she's doing here is she's looking at the equating the guns to insects and viewing them as specimens made up out of particular cultural phenomena, and in fact specimens that can move around the world and do move around the world and have consequences in the way they kind of take over spaces. In this work, which was part of the commission, this is an Australian weapon, and I guess she's equating the peacekeeping forces, the Australian involvement in the peacekeeping forces, as part of this militarised realm which comes ashore and creates peace and then moves on to the next realm as well.
When I went to Afghanistan, I really did question what the war artist thing was meant to be. I'd been interested in Wendy Sharp's work years ago. I remember being intrigued by her as a person, having gone to this very violent part of the world and made works. And it was only once I got there that I realised that all artists' work is after the experience, is that we don't go there to entertain the troops. We go there completely empowered by the Australian War Memorial to tell whatever story we want, and really we're empowered to do that, to say exactly what we want to say. So this is a work that I made in Afghanistan. This is actually JTAC. My experience of war was reading All Quiet on the Western Front. I was born the year after conscription finished in Vietnam. I was completely paranoid of being conscripted. I didn't want to go to war. I'd read All Quiet on the Western Front when I was 13, and I think it's probably a bit young to read that book. But it left a very lasting impression on me of the horror of what the particularly young men have to go through in so-called service of their country. Once I was there, I took over 1,000 photographs, which you'll see at the end of my talk. Was that their experience is what I was interested in. I was interested in the human condition. I guess I'm always interested in the human condition. And most of my work is pretty autobiographical, so in a way the paintings that I made are about my experience of Afghanistan through their often much more dramatic experience of being a soldier for 8 months in Afghanistan. This is young Daniel Spain. So this work actually was made from a photograph. When I first got back, I'd taken a lot of photographs, as I said, over 1,000. A lot of them I got the guys to stare into the sun. I did a similar thing to Deborah. I was looking for something. I was looking for some visual sign that would trigger later work, and possibly it was just an exhibition of photographs. But I found that getting these young guys to look directly into the sun was sort of, in a way, symbolic of the great force that they were facing, the great darkness, but an inversion of that it was so bright that it was dazzling to them. So really I'm just finding my way with this work, but I quickly realised that I needed those guys in front of me, and I needed them to bring that experience that I'd seen firsthand in Afghanistan. I needed them to bring it to me. And there's something about that age-old idea of portraiture, of having the person in front of you and the portrait being a description of the time that you've spent with someone, a historical record, I guess, of the time that the artist spends with the subject. But this was then a much more powerful way to do that, by getting these guys into the studio, getting them naked, which is surprisingly easy. This is Troy Park, who was an ex-SAS soldier who was in Afghanistan, who was on his 8th deployment to Afghanistan, but the second 4 deployments was as a mercenary. So he was basically paid to be a private force inside Afghanistan. He really didn't like this painting, but a lot of them, and he said the same thing, he said, you've made me look the way I feel, and I think that's success from what I'm looking for. Obviously he's SAS, so I'm not meant to be showing his image, but no one can tell who it is anyway. And that's Captain S, that's Shane Mackay, the drawing that I showed you earlier. This is the first live sitting that I made. I got him in, I told him the idea, I said, Shane, there's only one catch, I need you to get all your gear off. And before I finished the sentence, he was unbuttoning his shirt. This is an image that I made inside Afghanistan using Photoshop. If you look up close, it's pretty rough. It's literally a collage, playing with the idea of my Rorschach thing that I've been doing. But this is all taken off 2 Taliban guys who were caught. We don't really understand the complexities until you get there. The Taliban are allowed to carry up to 500 grams of opium on them. They're allowed to have it. The Taliban aren't, but any Afghan men are allowed to carry an AK-47. They're allowed to have one what do you call it? What's the case? 30 bullets for an AK-47, up to 500 grams of opium. But if they're caught with a mobile phone battery, they're arrested instantly, because there's no mobile reception in the Uruzgan Valley. The only reason anyone has mobile phones is to detonate IEDs. So this basically was the stuff that the Australian military had taken off these men.
I've been interested in making work that's about the aftermath and consequences of war. And as a marble sculptor, of course, I've been approached many times to make memorials, and the idea of memorial is imbued into the material. Stone and granite monoliths that pepper social spaces across the world, all very similar in format. And I'd made this work called As of Today, which was originally inspired by the fact that I, like most of you here, and like a few down the front, only have an experience of war through the news media, to see it as another statistic. And I thought I'd make a memorial that was actually an ongoing memorial to an ongoing tragedy. And the fact that every day we would see in the newspaper in the last couple of years, 5 more guys hit by a rocket, or an IED had taken out 1 more soldier. And it seems so distant removed from our daily lives. I thought I'd just make a very simple marble work and make it as a dedicated act. The idea that I would make one every time I saw that there was another casualty in Afghanistan. And the fact that this war is ongoing would have this cumulative effect. Now, at first, of course, I didn't really think about that very much. As in, I didn't think of the direct consequence of each one is a name, each one is a body, and each one has a family, has friends, has kin. And this is actually the ceremonial fashion in which Australia uses to fold the flag. Everyone knows the American triangle that you fold, and you see it in films and such. The Australian official version of folding the flag is in fact this concertinaed square effect. Using pink, fleshy pink Australian marble, I set about making one for each time there was a casualty in Afghanistan. Now, Christopher Lambert, having recovered from his cancer and dealing with the loss of his son's death, was to look to see all these mates that Matthew used to keep together and could see this devastating consequence. He could deal with his son's loss, but he couldn't deal with the fact that nobody was talking about the suicides 12 months later, the ripple effects. So he decided that he'd at least try and talk to his local RSL chapter. Now, when he initially approached them, then the RSL chapter said, "It's an ongoing conflict, mate. We don't want to have anything to do with that. When you have a full list of our, those locals who served, we'll put up a plaque." And of course, that intensely frustrated Christopher Lambert, and he wanted to do something that would bring the friends together. And so he decided to build, and this is the heart of the story, he decided to build a shed. The idea was to wrangle all the mates, all those he'd served with who were nowhere. They in and out, driving around Australia, not really settled down. This was an idea that he could contact them all and they'd take him seriously, because somehow authority and organisations don't really pull them together the way a father of a mate you dearly love does. And he said, come and build this with us. Come and let's make a space to Matt.